I'm glad to be here. Last night I didn't think I was going to make it, but I made it. I want to make three sets of observations, two of them contextual and one substantive. The contextual ones I think are really important because we need to understand the big picture in the world in which we're living and moving into. So the first set of observations has to do with the tilt, the pivot, the rebalancing, which is real. Second is the situation in Crimea and Ukraine, which is impacting, I think, massively on the potential options for the future. And thirdly, I'll say a few words about CSDP NATO. As far as the tilt is concerned, there's nothing new about the tilt. This goes back to the Reagan Western White House, when US interests were already shifting towards the Pacific. It was massively intensified by the end of the Cold War, obviously. From the moment the Berlin Wall went down, US interests in Europe were on the decline. More recently, obviously, the rise of China and the very complexity of the situation, security situation in the Pacific. And all of this in the context of continuous American pressure on Europe or on NATO since the end of the Cold War and even before the end of the Cold War to go global, to turn this into a global alliance. And in a sense, the first tilt to Asia was ISAF. ISAF is the tilt to Asia. But it's a very real tilt, even though it's a very old tilt. US budget cuts, the sequester. The United States is a frugal superpower which is obliged to make really drastic choices, cannot do everything anymore. And the Obama doctrine encapsulates precisely that. Obama was kind of caught, when he came into power, was caught in a maelstrom of post-Bush strategic thinking, which pitted a number of liberals arguing for multilateralism, institutionalism, and global governance, a number of realists who were insisting on the continuing salience of power politics, but under a stricter interpretation of US national interest, both camps being challenged by an increasing number of isolationists, and they're a very important camp, who were shortly to provide intellectual sustenance for the Tea Party. But even within the camp of realism, we saw a big divide and a growing divide, and that divide is still there today, between those who really want to impose strict limits on the usefulness of American power and who argue for a much, much more restrained US role in the world. Barry Posen's new book, Restraint, a very important book. And on the other hand, those like Brooks and Walford and whatnot who believe that the US can continue to exercise hegemony forever. At the same time, the US public is weary of foreign involvement. A Pew poll in 2011, 58% of Americans believe the US should pay much less attention to overseas problems. 65% want to reduce overseas military commitments drastically. 72% in favor of cutting overseas aid. And the figures on Ukraine are that 63% of Americans think the United States should have nothing to do with Ukraine. Only 31%, half that number, are in favor. So the Obama doctrine is a mix of overall strategic caution, a determination to focus on absolute priorities, a reluctance to become involved in regional security crises, and above all, and I stress this, can't stress it enough, an invitation to America's allies all around the world to assume much greater responsibility for their own security or the security of their own neighborhoods. And that is likely, I would predict, I don't bridge anything anywhere, I'm just trying to pick up, vibes. I think that's a bipartisan position. There has been virtually nobody in the United States arguing vociferously for involvement in Ukraine, Crimea. The strategic guidance paper of January 2012 reflects America's deepest national interests. The tilt to Asia is real. Oh, we get the lip service to the European allies at the Munich Security Conference. We love you, we'll never abandon you. Don't be worried about the tilt. But one shouldn't have any illusions about the serious national interests involved here. The party, as far as Europe is concerned, is over. Hillary Clinton may say, well, why don't you tilt with us? But we may tilt commercially and economically, but we're not tilting militarily. Ukraine, Crimea, what Libya revealed was that the model of leading from behind is a real model, and it's kind of here to stay. We've seen it again in Mali, we've seen it in Syria, and now we're seeing it again. What Crimea and Ukraine have done is to ask the really tough questions about NATO that few bothered to ask in the first 2 decades of the post-war world. Why was the US allying with the enlargement countries, which did not reflect its vital interests and which were not bringing a great deal to the table? And how seriously committed was the US to Article 5? Those questions are now coming front and center in the American debate. We saw an outpouring of bitterness in the United States. I was there throughout the whole of that, I mean, this spring, against European fecklessness, arrogance, and incompetence in the negotiations and the handling and the managing of the Ukraine dossier, if you like. The official version was given by Victoria Newland, in a word which we don't repeat at this table. But the unofficial word is given on a listserv which regroups all the great specialists of international relations in the United States. And that listserv was 100% consensus. The Europeans screwed up, and they have made life extremely difficult now for Americans. The collapse, if you like, of the European neighborhood policy in its totality. I won't go through that, but a wonderful new piece by Stefan Lehn looks at all of the misguided assumptions which have led to the collapse of the European neighborhood policy. So the impact in the US of the Ukraine crisis, I think, is that old politics are back with a vengeance, if ever they went away. I'm not sure they ever went away. The realists are triumphant. Cock-a-hoop. Woohoo! Get your Kenneth Waltz back off the shelf and dust it off and start reading again, because this is what life is all about. And the combination of that sense of the return of realism and of the Obama doctrine is leading to a profound rethink of the US role in the world, back to the tilt, if you like. NATO is now perceived in the discourse in the US as a serious problem. The architects of enlargement are massively on the defensive. They are defending themselves, but they are being put back against the wall. Why did you do this? Enlargement, the argument is, was done unthinkingly, on the assumption that it was a win-win for the United States, not because of American interests, but because of American reputation. And we're beginning to hear the sorts of remarks which were made in foreign policy recently, that foreign policy is not about the tooth fairy. The current debate is about US interests, vital or otherwise. And the only interest, we get a very interesting article here by the same Barry Posen, the book Restraint, etc., but Posen's article in the National Interest last week, or a couple of weeks ago, which says, I quote, this is the headline, if in the worst case all of Ukraine were to fall to Russia, it would have little impact on the security of the United States. And his argument there is that you just should not be doing this in the way in which it was done over the last 15 years. Ukrainian membership of NATO, argues Stephen Walt in Foreign Policy, would be a massive mistake. The need to rethink fundamentally why the United States is getting into these alliances. Now, this is becoming the received wisdom in the discourse over in the United States. And it's having massive repercussions, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. You remember Chuck Hagel had to dash across the Pacific a few weeks ago just to reassure the Japanese that the US was serious about supporting them over the Senkaku Islands. So the ripple effect of this from Europe to Asia is very real as well. What does the US want from NATO? It's not clear. There's a growing irritation about the constant existential questions. What is NATO for? We've had these conferences. I've been to 3 or 4 or 5 conferences this year on this issue, and the question becomes kind of annoying. Most American military officers never come into contact with NATO. It's no longer the privileged dialogue for EU-US, no longer the privileged agency for EU-US dialogue. The umpteenth new security strategic concept is being prepared for Wales. I think if I were to sum up the ambient wisdom in the United States, it is that if NATO cannot go global, then let's hand it over to the Europeans. Which brings me to my third and very brief final set of remarks. Those who've heard me on this before, and I have to say that Claude France was horrified 2 years ago when I first threw this at this room, is that since it's not clear where NATO is going, and I'm not sure that it's clear where CSDP is going, and that I don't believe that a division of labor, I believe General Drouzier may disagree with me fundamentally on this, but I don't think a division of labor is either possible or desirable. I think that there is a growing consensus among a large number of experts on European security that somehow or other there has to be an intensified cooperation between NATO and CSDP. And I would go much further than that and argue that progressively, since the Americans are demanding that Europeans stand up, become adult, competent, capable of looking after themselves. And I've asked the question of senior American officials, are you serious? Do you really mean that you would be prepared to transfer leadership in the European theatre to the Europeans? The answer is always, convincingly, yes. Please do it. The problem is, we don't believe you're serious about wanting to do it. And that, I think, is the nature of the problem. So the answer to me is pretty simple. If the Americans are prepared to empower and enable Europeans to become competent and effective, then let's hold them to that, and let's do that through a progressive combination of the activities of CSDP and NATO, whereby Europeans increasingly take over responsibility for not just the soft stuff, but also the hard stuff. I'll leave it at that.